Thank you. First off, I'd like to thank Dr. Chatterjee, who's not able to be here today. Her advice is always appreciated, although often not heeded. I just want to make that clear before I start. So my thesis, my topic is Cesar Chavez and the 1968 fast, which I conclude was a turning point for the United Farm Workers. On Valentine's Day 1968, the Kern County, California Superior Court charged Cesar Chavez, picket captain Epifanio Camacho, and 300 John Does with contempt of court for failure to maintain a 15-foot distance between themselves on the picket line and for throwing dirt clods at a foreman during the ongoing strike against Gamara Vineyards. Camacho had a reputation for physically confronting strikebreakers. Chavez said that anyone responsible for violence should turn himself in, and announced that he was going to stop eating until everyone in the strike either ignored him or agreed to his view of nonviolence. By the end of the fast, 25 days later, I conclude that the UFW had been fatally transformed. The Delano grape strike in the fall of 1965 put the United Farm Workers on the map. It became a powerful force among farm workers, peaking at 80,000 members in 1973 and leading an international boycott of California wines and table grapes. Its leader, Cesar Chavez, became a symbol of the struggle for Mexican Americans for a better life. Sadly, California farm workers now live in conditions which are as bad as those which Chavez himself experienced as a child. The UFW had declined to 1/4 of its former size by the time Chavez died in 1993. Recent scholars have moved beyond the earlier hagiographic accounts of Chavez's moral vision to deal with the causes of this dramatic decline. Most recently, Arizona State University professor Matt Garcia, in his book From the Jaws of Victory, The Triumph and Tragedy of Cesar Chavez and the Farm Worker Movement, concluded that Chavez's inability to be self-critical after the defeat of the union-sponsored California Proposition 14 in 1976 and his subsequent isolation doomed the movement to failure. I conclude that the turning point was much earlier with the 1968 fast. Reading first-person accounts by farm workers, organizers, and volunteers, and the union newspaper El Malcriado, I found an organization whose internal contradictions revolved around the question of class allegiance. The UFW was a union, uniting all workers in militant class struggle, and at the same time, an arm of elite politics, allied with the Democratic Party, diverting class struggle into liberal causes, and dividing the working class. Before the fast, class struggle was the main thrust of the UFW. After the fast, it took a backseat to liberal politics. Although Chavez had become synonymous with the union during the strike, during the fast he became a saint. When, during the fast, Chavez went to court on the charges mentioned above, people fell to their knees as he passed. Doug Adair, union organizer and co-editor of El Malcriado, saw it this way. Things changed so tremendously during the fast. Until then, Cesar was the brother. After the fast, he was on a pedestal. He was going to be beatified by the Catholic Church. But if you're building a democratic union, it seems to me, it was a step in the wrong direction. The fast did more than make union democracy impossible. It marked dramatic shifts in the union's policy on nonviolence, the role of the boycott in the Democratic Party, and on immigrants, all evident in the crucial spring of 1968. In the beginning, the UFW did not have a united position on nonviolence. In 1965, El Malcriado had called strikebreakers dogs who should get exactly what they deserve. Faced with grower violence and widespread strikebreaking, picketers threw dirt clods at strikebreakers, as they called them out of the fields. Epifanio Camacho, a longtime farm worker from the area, was a leader in this militant class struggle. Chavez knew this. But Camacho's local ties and his aggressive and eloquent presence in meetings and on the picket lines made it difficult for Chavez to discipline him. In February 1968, Camacho's picket crew was accused of attacking strikebreakers in the fields, and Chavez used the FAS to isolate Camacho and make nonviolence union orthodoxy. At the same time, there was a shift in emphasis from the strike to the boycott. In 1965, El Malcriado featured union members calling on workers to join the strike. By 1968, picket lines had become perfunctory exercises carried out to justify the boycott. And El Malcriado was featuring photographs of the boycott and saying it was the only nonviolent weapon the union had left. A June 1966 editorial in El Malcriado had stated, "Farm workers will never get ahead if we depend on politicians. Whoever wins in November, farm workers will lose." By August 1968, El Malcriado was reporting on a meeting between Chavez and Vice President Humphrey. But the most striking shift was that in the union's policies toward immigrant workers. The UFW position on Mexican immigrants was problematic from the start. In 1965, El Malcriado complained that the Immigration Service closed their eyes to the mass use of wetbacks in the melon harvest. But at the same time, they condemned the starvation wages and reign of terror to which undocumented workers were subjected, and praised the non-citizens who quit work when they realized there's a strike. In 1967, El Malcriado had warned green card scabs that they were not only cowards and traitors, but that they were jeopardizing their green cards. In March 1968, the union threatened to turn over the names of green card scabs. On May 15th, 1968, El Malcriado announced that they had done so and published the names of 48 such individuals. Denouncing strikebreakers to the INS generated intense controversy and confusion. El Malcriado was forced to explain that the union was not against immigrants, but they were against wetbacks and green card holders being used as scabs. Turning strikebreakers over to the INS was the precursor to a more direct attack on immigrants, the wet line. Part of the UFW's campaign against illegals, the wet line, known officially as the UFW Border Patrol, was organized in 1974 by Cesar's cousin Manuel Chavez and physically attacked undocumented workers as they came across the border. Epifanio Camacho had always believed that the fight had to be won in the fields. Chavez had decided by 1968 to rely on the boycott and the Democratic Party. In July of 1970, the growers signed contracts with the union, and the strike and the boycott were called off. When the collective bargaining agreements came up for renewal in 1973, the UFW had spent most of its resources in electoral campaigns rather than organizing workers, and the union was defeated, beginning its downward trajectory. Before the fast, Chavez was a brother and an organizer. His canonization during the fast allowed him to stifle dissent and pursue a policy of class collaboration rather than class struggle. The strike became subservient to the boycott. Organizing workers became secondary to getting out the vote for the Democrats. Fighting scabs was replaced by turning wetbacks over to the INS. Contracts were negotiated top-down with growers rather than bottom-up by workers' strikes. Immigrants, increasingly the dominant workforce in the fields, never forgot and never forgave the wet line. While Chavez has become a cultural icon, the potential for a militant, inclusive union in the fields of California has still not been realized. Epifanio Camacho has the last word. He came to a different conclusion. "I learned," he said, "that to achieve liberation, it's necessary to adopt a more powerful weapon than the strike, the weapon of revolutionary struggle against the entire social political regime. However, strikes are, in some ways, like schools for communism, because it is during these activities that workers learn to struggle together for our interests." Thanks.
Do you have any questions by the judges?
So it seems like you're concluding that Chavez made the wrong decision when he chose to sort of align himself with the Democratic Party and the political left, if you will, as opposed to taking on both sides. what would you imagine if he had taken the other route? Would have been the result that would have been better?
Well, I can't imagine a result that could have been worse. Right now, there are no contracts for farm workers in California in the fields. So I have to go with considering that if working people can fight in their own interests, they should do that.
I have a more micro question. One of your slides said that Chavez did not impose a uniform non-violence approach. Could you elaborate on that?
Certainly. In the period before the fast, there was, using oral histories and evidence in El Malcriado, there was a lot of actual violence on the picket line. Fred Hirsch's oral history says that his crew had slingshots. Somebody else said that Camacho had a caterpillar on the back of his truck. Another woman said that all of the Filipino guys carried knives. In April of 1965, a farm worker was pistol whipped by a supervisor, and his father hit the supervisor with a hoe. And El Malcriado said, it was being published in Spanish at this point, El Malcriado says que el padre de Leopardo debería de haberle dado en toda la torre al contratista. Now, that means that the father of Leopardo should have effed him up. I mean, I can't figure any other way to translate darle en la torre to somebody. That's violence. So I think there's a lot of evidence to show that there was not a uniform policy of nonviolence within the United Farm Workers in the early days. It's an interesting question as to why that's not part of the official story.
Any other questions by the judges?
Just curious, the slide you had Alan Cranston, in reference to him, you didn't mention him. I always liked his politics. I'm wondering what that was referring to.
That's a picture of him visiting Chavez in his bed during the fast. And it was a paid political announcement by Cranston in El Malcriado several times in 1968.
One more question from the audience?
I think one of the things I see as problematic here is you've talked about the weaknesses of this decision, but there's no evidence whatsoever that you presented that pursuing perhaps a more violent alternative would have been more effective in achieving ends. And my own recollections during that period of time is that it's really questionable whether that would have actually reached some type of productive conclusion.
That's a comment. That's a comment that reflects the point of view, reflects the same question. I have the same answer. It's pretty clear to me that things couldn't get any worse for farmers in California at this point. What is clear to me is that other unions have taken other points of view around this question of organized class struggle. The example that occurs to me actually is the Toledo Auto Light strike of 1934, in which the question of strikebreakers is always a question, right? In other words, what do you do with strikebreakers? Particularly when there's a lot of people coming in to take those jobs. And in 1934, in the Toledo Auto strike, the Socialist Party actually had organized unemployed councils that brought unemployed workers to support the strikers and to deal physically with strikebreakers, National Guard, a lot of other things. I think that the movements of the 30s showed a different approach to class struggle than the point of view that won and created the decline of the farm workers in 1968.
We have time for another question?
Yeah.
Okay, one more question?
Hi. I'm looking at it more from a social movement perspective. And what seems to be happening in your thesis here that's not really explained is the issue of co-optation of the social movement. And it makes sense that the Democratic Party would align with elements of this particular movement that it can incorporate into its own agenda, and it then therefore divides and conquers and alienates those groups. And I think we've seen this throughout social movement history. Those that are more violent are going to be cast off as extremists. And I think there's a valid point that should be acknowledged in your thesis, that you have to understand that, yes, while the movement is coming out, how do you explain that a more militant outcome would engender the ideas that you hope to accomplish? It's not necessarily a comment, it's something that should be addressed in your thesis if you're arguing that a more militant outcome is going to be better than what we have. That may be true, but how would you include that in your research to show so far what we've seen, maybe in other parts of the world, but then you would have to account for different regime types. You would have to account for the use of repression. I think this also speaks to a larger issue, is if you have laborers that are not legal documented citizens, they don't have voting power, and that also minimizes the power that they can amass from a political standpoint. So it's just something that maybe you should consider in your thesis to strengthen your argument.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And I can see how, I mean, that is an argument for not pursuing electoral politics if your main workforce is undocumented. So I appreciate your comments. Thank you very much.
We have time for one more? Okay, unfortunately, we'll save the comments for after the presentations. You can approach the author. And on to our next one.